Welcome to the RevRec Gals podcast, where two consultants with over 30 years combined experience share stories about the implementation and challenges of revenue recognition accounting. I'm Susan.
And I'm Natasha.
And we are the RevRec Gals.
Welcome to another episode of RevRec Gals. Today, we're going to be talking about the concept of distinct and capable of being distinct, not only individually, but within the context of the contract. It's a pretty big topic that has tons of downstream effects on how the revenue guidance is applied. Susan, do you have anything you want to highlight as we dive into this?
I think this is really fascinating because they ask you to use this term distinct in defining your performance obligations. Now, when I think of something distinct, I think each item is, you have a product that's distinct. You have a service that's distinct. In the context of ASC 606, you're really looking at more than that. You're looking at, is the good and service distinct on its own, or is it distinct as a bundle of goods and services? In which case, it may be distinct on its own, but it may, in another instance, not be distinct because it's part of a bundle. Or is it a series of distinct goods and services that have substantially the same method of transfer and pattern of recognition? It's such a broad topic to talk about.
And I think importantly, it's like a crucial conversation to be having early on because it literally impacts everything else up and downstream. Identifying your performance obligations requires this concept of evaluating distinct, and rightfully so, because as you go through and figure out what are your performance obligations, how are you going to allocate to them? How are you establishing SSP at the performance obligation level? Are you evaluating things like modifications, material rates? All of those things will be treated differently depending on how you define your performance obligations. And specifically, the last one you mentioned, this series of distinct goods and services being substantially the same and having the same pattern of transfer, that series guidance has very specific ramifications downstream for practical expedience and how you recognize revenue that have pretty big impact to how you do that, depending on whether the answer is yes or no.
Yeah. And in regards to that last one, we talk about how the 5 steps are not necessarily sequential. You're going back and forth. So in this case, step 5, you're talking about the timing of your recognition and your pattern of recognition and transfer and control. But that then plays to whether you determine it's a series of distinct goods and services.
That's such a great point because I think this is ultimately a step 2 question. The concept of distinct, it exists in step 2 of the guidance. But in order to appropriately think about it, you have to think about those downstream, like step 5, pattern of transfer. You're really having to think holistically about the whole revenue model and downstream effects to make sure it makes sense, to make sure it feels right. And it's not sequential. It's, okay, here's this question that exists in step 2, but how are we thinking about it at step 5 and step 4, pattern of transfer and allocation, and how we think about transaction price? How does that interact in all of those steps? And I think it doesn't exist in a silo.
Well, let's talk a little more about series of distinct goods and services. So we're talking about that, but what really is it? It's when you have something that is being transferred to the customer over time. So this is always related to an over time. And each day or each unit is substantially the same. So we're talking about maintenance and support, the right to updates and upgrades, things that typically the customer has the right to receive, and you have the ability to deliver on like a daily basis. Or maybe for professional services, each unit of delivery, maybe you have it hourly, maybe you have it daily, those are substantially the same. So if you sell them a 10-pack of professional services, that 10-pack may be considered its own performance obligation. And maintenance and support, you're not going to say, I'm selling a 1-year contract, I have 365 days of performance obligations. You're looking at as, no, I have this series. Each day is the same. I have one performance obligation that is going to be recognized over that 1 year period.
It's a great point. And I think it can be easy to get confused on this because when you think about a 1 year maintenance or support contract, the way it's consumed by the customer can look lumpy. A customer could not contact support or have any issues for 3 months, and then they could call 3 times in a week. And that's how they consume it. But from a delivery perspective, from what we're delivering to the customer, it's a stand ready performance obligation where at any given day they could call. We have to be ready every single day. They have the same access to support every single day, even though it might actually be consumed in a different pattern. I think that it's really important to be thinking about this. What are we actually providing and delivering? Is it individual hours of support? In the case we're talking about, no, it's continuous access 365 days a year to support. Now, it could be different. It could be that it really is 10 hours of support. Maybe you buy a bundle of 10 hours of support and it's used and delivered as it's actually consumed. But that's where you get into questions on what's the nature. Are you delivering 365 days or are you delivering 10 hours of support? And your answer wildly can change.
And just because we're talking about a series doesn't mean we're talking about something that's going to be recognized ratably. A series could be a drawdown of a prepay. It could be those professional services that are recognized as delivered. But because the nature of the performance obligation is such that they have the same pattern of transfer and they're substantially the same, they become a single performance obligation.
Yes. And this is so important because they're a single performance obligation, but it's a series of single performance obligations that are essentially being combined. So from an allocation perspective, you can kind of lump them together for the purposes of allocating your contract. But ultimately, you might not, depending on if you have a consumption-based model, that series, it will be allocated differently based on maybe a different measure. And so I think the way it impacts downstream, like your modifications, the modification guidance comes really big into play here because that concept is distinct is in that flow chart. And so what's remaining to be delivered is distinct from what's already been delivered because you have a series. You have a wildly different answer than if it's not distinct and you don't have a series. There's a downstream impact even after you start recognizing revenue. How you think about modifications is impacted by this.
And this is a little different than they also have this concept of bundles of goods and services. So we've been talking about a series, but there are also times where you bundle it. And this is what I find interesting because, as I mentioned before, you may have products and services that you sell individually, and they're deemed to be individual performance obligations. But in another instance, they may be combined. For example, and I think I've brought it up in other episodes, I have a client that sells their hardware with maintenance and support and a SaaS offering as a bundle. And because these bundles are priced differently and they are at a discount from the total value of the pieces, they're considered their own performance obligation. So when you're doing your allocation, you're allocating against this bundle, but you actually have to then do a second allocation because of the timing of delivery. You have some upfront revenue and you have some over time. Here, you're defining it as performance obligation, but then when you get to your allocation, you actually have to look at it further. If you think about it, they could have a bundle of goods and services that maybe they don't sell separately, in which case your first allocation goes to that bundle and you have to use something to determine how much is recognized upfront versus over time. And you may then use it by reference to some other goods and services.
So from an allocation perspective, if they're distinct performance obligations, even if you might not have evidence of what they sell it for elsewhere, you still have to come up with something to allocate to each distinct performance obligation. And I think what this highlights is how important that conclusion is, because if you conclude that they aren't in fact distinct, and we haven't even gotten to distinct within the context of the contract, how it might change from one contract to another, even within the same organization, even with the same products, one contract to another, your conclusion might change. And the reason that's so important is because exactly to your point, as we allocate, if they're distinct, you have to allocate somehow the upfront and overtime components. If they're not distinct, you can't do that. And you have to come up with some sort of way of measuring performance for the entirety of the performance obligation. It's one of those things that when it comes to software and the associated updates and upgrades, people used to straight line term licenses under the old guidance because they weren't able to establish VSOE because it was never sold separately. And under the new guidance with best estimated selling price and SSP, all of a sudden under 606, people had to start separating term license. A lot of people didn't want to do because all of a sudden they had this upfront and overtime. And before it was like, wait, it's easier just to do it over time, like SaaS. Why does this matter? There are exceptions to that. And the exceptions I've seen are usually in the security space. There are a few other nuanced spaces, but what's interesting there is in most cases with term license, maybe I should say out loud what a term license is. So what's different about a software license versus a term license? A perpetual license being you sell a perpetual license to software that goes on forever, and then you purchase support and or maintenance that goes with it, usually in 1, 2, 3 year chunks or whatever. And then a term license is where people are purchasing the right to use a license for a specific period of time, let's say 1, 2, 3 years. And usually what ends up happening is it's bundled with the support and the maintenance that goes with it for the same period of time, which is why the support and maintenance is never sold separately because it's always sold together. Whereas with perpetual license, they bundle it in the first contract, but then the renewal support and maintenance gives you those standalone sales that people can use to allocate. So term license, people didn't do it before. The new guidance with FSP, they were required to. The exceptions that I've seen is in security, because essentially security software is only as good as it is on any given day as the viruses that are trying to attack it. And so the updates and upgrades are essential to the functionality. The security software, if you don't keep it updated, will be useless in 3 months' time. And because that security software that's delivered up front essentially is rendered useless without the updates and upgrades or the maintenance that goes with it, it can't be considered distinct because you would never buy security software without the updates and upgrades. Part of its value is that it stays up to date.
So it's not distinct within the context of the contracts.
It might not even be capable of being distinct because it's not valuable without the updates and upgrades.
You bring up term license, and that's such a perfect example of this group of goods and services. It's the software and the maintenance, support, updates, upgrades that's bundled into one. And unlike the example I gave where they actually sell the components separately and have a value that they can use to split out that bundle, for a term license, you have to extrapolate how much you would take up front versus over time.
Yes. And it's the same thing where you have that 2-step allocation, because often you'll have an SSP for the bundle of the term license with the support that you can use if it's being sold with other things. And then your next step is to come up with some sort of allocation between the two, because the term software license is usually distinct from the associated support, unless it's one of these nuanced security scenarios. There are a few other ones I've seen done successfully, but security is the classic one.
The first place I look is at the price list. If something is priced as a bundle, it potentially has the capability of being distinct as a bundle. Again, we're going back and looking at what are your selling practices and how does your business run? And that's driving some of these decisions.
One of the examples I think about a lot, because I think it makes this concept really tangible for me as a consumer. So many times when we're working with software and SaaS companies, it's a little bit hard to conceptualize how these products actually operate and how consumers interact with them. And ultimately, we have to talk to product. We have to talk to sales. How are you selling this to customer? What are they expecting? How are they interacting with it? The way I often think about it is you can go to Home Depot and buy 2x4s and a sink and a new faucet handle and a new stove and all the different pieces that would go into a kitchen remodel. But when you hire a contractor, like a full service contractor, to remodel your kitchen, and they come up with a quote and they include all of these things, As a consumer, I want a new kitchen. Don't show up and just deliver all the pieces because I don't want all the pieces. I want the fully functioning remodeled kitchen. Where it can get complex is that, well, actually, maybe a stove is distinct, even within the context. Because ultimately, as a consumer, they could deliver the whole kitchen. And if they're like, last minute, we cancel the stove, that would be fine. I could just go get a stove and have a handyman, or maybe if I were talented enough, hook it up myself. You actually have to go through that very detailed, extensive thing. The 2x4s, not distinct within the context of that contract. You could go buy 2x4s. I could go buy 2x4s from Home Depot right now, absolutely distinct. But within the context of a kitchen remodel, that's useless to me. Do not deliver me 2x4s. That's not helpful. If you take the 2x4s out separately, conceptually, they have no value to me. And so I think that's kind of like a good way of thinking about, am I really buying 2x4s and a stove for the items needed for kitchen remodel, or am I purchasing a full service kitchen remodel? And I think the answer is a little bit more complex. I think ultimately it's the kitchen remodel, but there might still be some distinct things buried in there, like the stove.
Talking about distinct within the context of the contract, one of the biggest ones I find is a SaaS offering, and you have professional services. Are those professional services really distinct, in which case they are for a specific deliverable, maybe that is tangent to your software, or are they really just enabling it and a part of the solution?
This was a big one that came up with a client. They were going through a fundraising round and they were getting feedback that they needed to allocate to the professional services associated with setting up their software. And they had not separately priced it, and they had just included it in their software. From one perspective, you could say these are professional services. Professional services could be sold on an hourly basis, and therefore you can quantify it. Takes about, let's say, 5 hours to set this up. Let's say you charge $200 an hour for these services. Maybe this company doesn't do it, but other companies might sell services for similar resources to do that. That was what they were being asked to do. But when I came in, I said, okay, well, are you sure that these are really distinct? What are these services really doing? Can other people set up the software? Can other people flip a switch? Are you planning on training other people and making them capable of doing it? Or is this sort of an internal process of, here's your software, but every time we bring on a new customer, internally, under the hood, where the customer can't really go, or maybe they can go, but they're not really going to touch it. You kind of keep them locked out because you don't want them to mess it up. And someone needs to go in and think about what needs to be plugged in here or put on there, or which aspects need to be turned on, or which pieces need to be labeled in certain ways. In which case, if the customer can't do it, if a third party can't do it, if it's not really set up to be done by anyone else, is this actually a distinct performance obligation, or is this work that is required to be done by the company in order to deliver the software solution to the customer in the way that it was promised? In which case, maybe it's not actually a distinct performance obligation. Going through this scenario for me was very nuanced. It was, it's like, so are you planning on making it available to customers? Like, how unavailable to customers is it? Like, is it that not every user could do it, but a super user could do it? It's a very nuanced conversation, and small changes can make a big difference between two different companies.
This whole concept of distinct within the context of the contract. So not only is it distinct, but is it distinct within the context of the contract? And your example of building a kitchen, like none of those 2x4s are distinct within the context of the contract because you've purchased a kitchen remodel. What the guidance says is it may not be distinct if it significantly integrates with other promises in the contract, or if one or more significantly modifies or customizes other goods and services, or if they're highly interdependent or highly integrated. Now, sometimes that's tough to really assess. Is something really highly integrated or highly interdependent? Your example of the security software. The software and the updates and upgrades are so highly interdependent, so integrated that the software is rendered useless without it. Why would you buy it?
It goes back to the phone example too. Like my phone is a paperweight without the operating software. Most people out there cannot take a phone without operating software and actually make it useful.
Yeah, they're so highly interdependent and integrated that that operating system and the phone itself become one performance obligation.
And interestingly, the Android operating system is sold or licensed to Samsung or other phone providers. So within that context of that contract, when they're selling to these third parties that are going to integrate it into their phones, then that is distinct. The operating software is distinct from the phone in that scenario because it's going to be used on a different phone. When Google sells it on a Pixel, it's not distinct. Because as a consumer, when I purchase the phone with the operating software, I'm not like, oh, great, I have this operating software. I'm going to take it to any phone I want. No, I am buying a functioning phone. I think that's a great example. Google, same company, Android operating system, same product, sold in two different ways, two different conclusions on whether it's capable of being distinct within the context of the contract.
Well, and even before all of these SaaS offerings, you would sell actual licenses to the software. So when you sold it with the initial server, and maybe you sold them 5 admin licenses, that may all be considered one performance obligation. But then if they buy another one so that they can enable someone else, then it's its own performance obligation.
It's nuanced.
It really is. So yeah, it's interesting how the same good or service will be treated differently under different circumstances, different across companies, but also different within the same company and different transactions.
And I think it's such a good demonstration of why this conversation is so important, because as you were mentioning earlier, it impacts how you allocate. Maybe you need a 2-step allocation, and then it impacts the timing. Is it upfront? Is it over time? And then ultimately modifications, all these other downstream impacts. I think it's important not to undersell how important this conclusion is, because I got brought in for this project. They were going to change their entire revenue model to recognize revenue and carve out some portion for the services. And actually, now I'm wondering if it was going the other direction. They were already carving out for the services, and then someone told them they needed to bring it together. They were getting this pressure to do it one way. And then I'm like, who did you talk to? How familiar are they with your product? Are they revenue experts? Let's talk about this a little bit more. Maybe you don't actually need to do what you're being asked to do. And it's not straightforward. In that scenario, I was like, honestly, first glance, I could come up with a position that would support either scenario. In order to really come to a conclusion, you need the context of the whole business. It takes a lot more time to talk to product, to talk to customers. This is a small enough company and an early stage enough company that how we concluded wasn't so important today. So I sort of said, think about where are you going and how are you going to conclude tomorrow? Almost from a planning perspective of, are you trying to make these separate services in the future? Are you going to charge for these in the future? Have you just not gotten to the point where it is configurable, but you're trying to make it configurable? And it's just that your software development hasn't caught up yet. It wasn't super clear. I don't think there was a really good answer. Maybe at some point it wasn't distinct and then it's going to become distinct. And so I had them think about that. Where are you going? Where do you think you're going to be in 6 months? What's your conclusion then? And then what happens before then? You can evaluate the materiality, all those things. But if you're a rapidly growing company, don't think you can make a conclusion and it's going to be static, because, you could make a conclusion based on today's circumstances and then change 6 months later and have to come up with a new conclusion. And if no one's paying attention, you might just keep doing it the old way, even though it doesn't make sense anymore.
And it's interesting because you may get all the way to step 4 of allocating the transaction and looking at SSP. And you're finding that when you're looking at SSP, you have these outliers that turn out to be, a bundle that you then have to say, oh, maybe these are distinct performance obligations that I need to look at separately. And that's what happened with my client is they had these bundles of 3 and 5 year services that they were treating like 3 years of annual service when in fact they were being sold differently and needed to be treated as their own performance obligations.
Ideally, we get ahead of these things and we know about them as they're coming. But I think that's a great example. Sometimes we don't see it until it shows up in an SSP analysis.
You would think that the salespeople are selling it the same, but maybe they're not discounting it as much because the discount's already embedded into the bundle.
And this kind of makes me circle back to how are you recording it in the system and thinking about your SKUs. To a certain extent, conceptually, ideally, every company would have this price list, the list of all the things being sold. And there would be a SKU or a product ID associated with each one of those. And those would be consistently used and go through the system consistently. But realistically, in startups especially that are moving quick and growing quickly, they're not always done that way. People pick a SKU, they put it on an order form, then they sell what they want, they price it accordingly, and then it comes through the system and we're like, what's this? It looks different. So really trying to have controls so that you can catch that when it happens, but then also work with your sales organizations and your product teams to make sure that you do have price lists that are used consistently and being involved in that process up front so that you can come up with these conclusions based on the way it's being sold. You had mentioned in another discussion this idea of like understanding your use cases, understanding your business practices, how it's being sold. Ideally, you'd come up with a conclusion on a SKU by SKU basis so that you can come up with rules in your system based on whether it's distinct or not, that then dictates how you're recognizing revenue from beginning to end. That assumes that these SKUs are being used reliably.
That's very true. So in summary, as we always talk about, understanding your business practices, partnering with sales, partnering with the pricing team and the marketing team, understanding what are you selling, how are you selling it, what are your selling practices and discounting practices.
Keeping your data clean.
Yeah, keeping your data clean. Understanding the nature of your goods and services to determine, are they integrated? Are they combined? Or on the other side, do you have a product you're offering that actually has multiple performance obligations within it, like the term-based software?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to think about and goes back to that this is a subjective and important conclusion. And it's not one that you can come to a conclusion and be done. You really have to monitor it to see how your business practices are evolving and changing to make sure that your conclusion still stands over time.
This concludes our episode. Stay tuned bi-weekly as we talk all things revenue recognition. You can be notified of new episodes and other information by following us on LinkedIn. Feedback and topic suggestions are always welcome through LinkedIn or by emailing us at revrecgals@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. The examples discussed are based on specific company dynamics. Check in with your auditors before making changes to your current processes. Specializing in revenue recognition may result in employment for life. Please consult your friends and family before pursuing this career.